Conversations on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Welcome everybody back to Conversation on Race and Policing. My name is Stan Fleck from the Westside Action Group, 35 years Riverside Fire Department. I'd also like to introduce other people on the panel. Michael German, former FBI agent. Mary Teixeira, Professor Emeritus of Sociology. Amber Broden, CSUSB grad and CSU Dominguez Hills. Robbie Madrigal, Public Affairs, and Matt Patino, Grafton Hills College. Today on Conversation of Race and Policing, we have Rahim Kurwa and Indefensible Spaces. And now I'd like to pass it on to Matt Patino for the land acknowledgement.
Thank you. California State University San Bernardino acknowledges that the land on which our San Bernardino facility is sited is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Marahayam, commonly referred to as the Serrano people, which in the contemporary era are represented by two federally recognized Indian tribes, the Yuhaviatam of San Manuel Nation and the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. Our histories and stories are intertwined in this space, and by sharing them in culturally appropriate ways, we honor and celebrate our indigenous neighbors and partners. Since 1965, CSUSB's development has benefited and will continue to benefit from this land's location and resources, and we recognize this. Along with this land acknowledgement, this university affirms tribal sovereignty and a responsibility to work with these tribes to further mutual respect and gratitude for all those involved. And now I'll throw it over to Mike.
Thanks, Matt. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rahim Kurwa. He's an associate professor in the Department of Criminology, Law and Justice, and faculty affiliate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His work is broadly focused on the policing of housing. His book, Indefensible Spaces, Policing and the Struggle for Housing, traces the past century of Black history in Los Angeles' northernmost outpost, known as Antelope Valley, showing how pre-1968 methods of racial segregation in this region have been replaced today by policing. His other interests include the family implications of the policing of housing assistance, the interrelatedness of policing and segregation, and the history of policing in public housing and its successor programs. We'll share links in the chat to upcoming events in our series, including Amherst College's Dr. Stefan Bradley speaking with us next Wednesday about his new book, If We Don't Get It, A People's History of Ferguson. For our guest today, we will share Dr. Kurwa's faculty page and his new book, and we'll have several paper copies of the book to give away at the end of today's session. You can also find his book at the UC Press website that we'll share, where you can download the ebook for free. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Kurwa. I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real treat to be part of this conversation, and especially as it gave me the chance to watch and listen to so many of the prior conversations that you've been having in this really remarkable series over several years. And I've gotten the chance to learn a lot from the work that you all have been doing. So I'm very grateful. And it's also especially nice to be in conversation with people in Southern California who will be familiar with the Antelope Valley to some degree. And also, I think what happened in the Antelope Valley is a shared experience across a much broader part of Southern California and the California region. By way of introduction, I wanted to say that this book is really centered on the experience of one tenant who becomes a sort of stand-in for a broader set of processes that happen in the Antelope Valley in sort of like the early 2000s and into the early 2010s. And that story really revolves around a woman named Michelle Ross, who was a tenant in the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. And in 2008, her and her family moved to Palmdale in the Antelope Valley. And the Antelope Valley is sort of like the northernmost outpost of Los Angeles County, and it's about a 1 hour drive, if you're lucky, from sort of like the Hollywood sign, if you will, right? Take the 5 to the 14, or take the 2 highway through the mountains, right? It's on the other side of the Los Angeles National Forest. And that makes it sort of disconnected in many ways. But that disconnection geographically should not mask the way that the Antelope Valley is very deeply connected to how Los Angeles as a whole works. And so in the years after Michelle Ross moved to Palmdale, she found herself the subject of constant harassment on the basis not only of her race and gender, but also on the basis of her status as a tenant in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Starting in 2009, a number of city inspectors and members of the Housing Authority of the County of Los Angeles staff, as well as sheriff's deputies from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, would begin to frequently visit her home and open inspections on the validity of her Section 8 tenancy. From these moments, which occurred every so often between 2009 and 2010, her name and identity was also placed on a Facebook page called I Hate Section 8, a sort of early precursor to the digital policing that I think is happening in many neighborhoods around the country today as well. And from there were instances in which her home was graffitied and in which a bottle of what was alleged to be urine was thrown at her home and her family. At times, these inspections led by city investigators and the LA County Sheriff's Department would include up to 20 sheriff's officers showing up at her house to sort of go through her home in the presence of her children. And as a result, Michelle Ross and her family were effectively pushed out of the neighborhood. They at first moved to Lancaster. They felt they couldn't safely sleep in their home at night. And looked at the potential of moving even out of the Antelope Valley. And Michelle Ross was really not alone. She was one of thousands of other tenants, especially Black families and especially women-led households that moved to the Antelope Valley during this period and who experienced some version of this kind of harassment and policing done not only by arms of the government, whether that's at the city or county level, but also by neighbors through these sort of digital platforms at the time, like Facebook. And the book explores how this process happened and what the fallout of this process has been over the years. And what I argue is that there are really 3 threads or 3 things that were occurring in a more broad sense in our society that intersected in this moment in the Antelope Valley. The first is that the Antelope Valley has become something like Los Angeles's safety valve. It is the place where Los Angeles's crises and inequalities and sort of unsustainable dynamics get kind of relieved, where that pressure gets relieved in the Antelope Valley. If housing prices are too unaffordable for working class people, the Antelope Valley is there as a source of cheap housing, provided that you're willing to make that drive, right? And this history has occurred for generations, right? And the Antelope Valley actually takes on this role of the safety valve back in the wake of World War II, as the War Department insists on dispersing war production in the aftermath of World War II. And the county sort of satisfies that dispersal order by moving Lockheed, Boeing, Edwards Air Force Base into the Antelope Valley to become a major site of industrial aerospace production in this era, right? That is like the sort of first moment of the safety valve, but it continues. And even at the end of the Cold War, as those investments begin to wither away and the Antelope Valley loses its sort of economic foothold, it becomes LA's source of cheap housing and relieves some of LA's sort of housing crisis as early as the late 1980s and early 1990s, right? Even today, in the aftermath of the processes the book covers, the Antelope Valley is once again being seen as a solution to LA's homelessness and housing crisis. It's become a place where a lot of the remnants and waste byproducts from LA's fires is being dumped. It still has this sort of dynamic of this safety valve that's going on. So that's sort of piece one of how this process of policing of tenants like Michelle Ross happened. Piece two is a national question of housing policy. And it's really about the story of how our federal housing policy has evolved from housing the poor in public housing, like one of your previous scholars, Madeline Hamlin, has discussed so well in her work on the Chicago Housing Authority, to a much more dispersed and sort of neoliberalized form of housing support delivery in the form of vouchers. And vouchers were really imagined to be a way to kind of generate economic upliftment in the absence of increased budgets under conditions of austerity. And the thought was that moving people to sort of theoretically wealthier or more middle class areas would enable them to experience economic benefits over time. And that's the process, the growth of these housing vouchers that has made it so that tenants with low incomes in Los Angeles getting assistance are pushed into the kind of peripheries and hinterlands of Los Angeles, because those are the weakest areas of the county's housing market, where landlords are most likely to choose to rent to them. And that is sort of the second piece of the story as to how this policing of Michelle Ross occurred, right? And the third piece of this story, I think, is the evolution of policing as a piece of the story of how home and housing more broadly has been regulated, right? We have a long history of scholarship about how policing functions as a tool of racial or residential segregation, right? That goes quite far back into our nation's history, but certainly is a part of the story of Jim Crow, and is part of the story of sort of resistance to the civil rights movement and the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And on the other hand, we also see in a more direct way the role of policing in regulating the home, right? From what Saidiya Hartman studies as the jump raids in the New York City tenements in the early 1900s, through the policing of public housing tenants through what were called the man in the house rules and the midnight raids in public housing in the 1950s and 60s. And these practices continue to evolve into our present, particularly through things like the spread of crime-free housing ordinances, the spread of nuisance ordinances in neighborhoods, and the powers that local housing authorities have to initiate and create inspections of people's homes more directly as well. So the policing of home has evolved, up into our present. And I think it's these three threads that kind of tie together in this moment in the 2000s in the Antelope Valley, as Section 8 tenants are moved through this combination of federal housing policy and the Antelope Valley's role as LA's safety valve, are moved in relatively large numbers into the Antelope Valley and find themselves subject to these kinds of policing that has come to greet them, and in many ways has replaced the old methods of restrictive covenants and so on from the early days of racial segregation. And that's essentially what I attempt the story I attempt to tell in the book. And alongside that story, the other thing I want to just briefly mention is that the book is also a story of resistance and placemaking and the creation of a different vision of home. And that story really begins in the early 1900s creation of a town called Sun Village, which was a sort of all-Black town in the Antelope Valley, and which I think is remade or echoed into the present as the tenants in the Antelope Valley, tenants in the voucher program, including Michelle Ross, who becomes the lead plaintiff in litigation, as tenants fight back against the policing of housing and begin to illustrate a new way of trying to make home and life in the Antelope Valley. So I hope that offers like a sort of thumbnail sketch of the book. And I'd love to take your questions and be in conversation with you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rahim. I would like to welcome everyone that is listening to this conversation to add questions or comments into the Q&A portion or Q&A area that you see on your screen. We'll be able to go through each of those questions and have them answered or addressed. Would anyone on our panel like to ask any questions or provide commentary so far?
All right, good. Anything else?
Yeah, Rahim, it's a common practice. I live in an area called Moreno Valley, and Moreno Valley was one of the areas that actually was low income. And so we got people from LA moving into the area. Banning, Beaumont area also had a juvenile hall. And because the kids were going to the facility, their families would move out to Banning and Beaumont area so they could be close to their kids. My question is, and this is very interesting. You mentioned Sun Valley, and there's always an area where they mass populate with minorities. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Sun Village is one of a sort of almost like archipelago of Black towns that are created in the late 1800s and early 1900s that kind of ring the periphery of Los Angeles proper. And I think part of the reason for that is that the LA of the early 1900s was really characterized by extreme racial segregation through especially restrictive covenants that really restricted Black residency into sort of like the South Central corridor and really created very difficult housing conditions. And on the other hand, extreme kind of like economic subjugation and difficult economic circumstances. And I think those two combined were like a pressure cooker that made it so that people really began to see the peripheries or leaving LA as a way to kind of experience a little bit more freedom, right? And so I think of places like Bruce's Beach, sort of in the Manhattan Beach area. And in fact, there's actually important connections between Bruce's Beach and Sun Village, but you also have Valley Verde in the hills. You have places in Indio, even as far as Palm Springs, Section 14 in Palm Springs, and a number of other places that kind of ring the periphery of LA, where people were able to kind of live life without the restrictions of restrictive covenants and other mechanisms of segregation and economic exploitation for whatever periods of time that these experiments were able to kind of survive and mobilize. And so I think to see this story within that broader story of these experiments or these forms of placemaking, I think is really important.
Thank you.
If I may, I would like to provide a commentary as well as appreciation, Rahim. I actually grew up in the Antelope Valley in Lancaster
Yeah.
specifically, so it's really nice to have a scholar like yourself looking at a section of LA County that often is falling under the underbelly of the conversation or falling within the underbelly of the conversation. And I actually had a student a couple of weeks ago ask me, why is it that so many people are being pushed into the Antelope Valley, right? And my main kind of response was the fact that we saw a lot of integration, especially after the LA riots happened, but I didn't inform her about the housing vouchers that were being provided. So that was really important for me to consider and hear from you. And also, I guess, speaking about personal experience, I've seen the rise of homelessness. I've heard from residents as well as my own family that it's, in a way, a pretty synonymous experience to what we saw during the crack epidemic, right? And then you tailor that or pair that in with the over-policing, the history of the AV being a sundown town as well, and you just kind of see that cycle continue. So I really appreciate your research on this area of the Antelope Valley.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that it kind of fills some of this history or story that I think does really need to be told about the full story of LA County, and you're right to note the continuing rise of unsheltered homelessness in the Antelope Valley. And for those who aren't so familiar with this area, that is a particularly devastating phenomenon in the Antelope Valley because this is essentially the high desert where in the summer the temperature is well above 100 degrees for many days of the year. You're directly exposed to the sun. In the winter, it can be bitterly cold. It doesn't snow as much now as it used to, but it is a place in LA that does get snow. It is very hard to materially survive once you're in the condition of unsheltered homelessness. And for voucher tenants, their experience of surveillance and policing was one that, on the other end of that, if you were evicted from your housing or if you lost your voucher, that was really one of the main next options is to live in a car, to double up with a friend or family, or to be in the condition of unsheltered homelessness. And it really shaped the way a lot of voucher tenants tried to navigate how to survive life in the Antelope Valley in spite of this level of policing that they encountered.
You had also mentioned people move into areas because of low cost housing. South Fontana built a large number of homes up there. And one of the things my wife and I were going to buy in this one section, we went up there and it was amazing how when it was empty and we were looking at the houses until they all sold, we found out that an entire group of people, all from the LA area, had moved in for the lower income housing. Mm-hmm. Just so happened, majority of them were Black. The houses were very nice, and so there were a few white tenants there, and I'm sure that they found it. I mean, we went up there after we bought our house and said we were going to live here. Let's go take a look. It was very different. So not only the homelessness of it, but can you talk about the opportunities for people moving out of LA to the Antelope Valley?
Yeah, absolutely. Even dating back to the early days of Sun Village, the newspaper advertisements that made their way back to Los Angeles in the Sentinel or the California Eagle would advertise that Sun Village was a place of opportunity where you could have land, you could farm if you wanted, you could have some more peace and quiet. And really, I think part of that was also the idea that you would be somewhat safe from the forces of segregation and exploitation that were really devastating the Black community in Los Angeles itself in those early years. And so there's always been that not just a push, but also a pull factor, right? And many, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, many Black residents moved out of Los Angeles into the Antelope Valley, specifically in appreciation of its sort of beautiful open space, and sort of quieter lifestyle. And I gotta say, like, I totally understand. It is a beautiful place to be in. The other thing that you mentioned about Fontana, there are many continuities between Fontana and the Antelope Valley. In Lynn Hudson's book called West of Jim Crow, she really tells a lot of that story of the evolution of Fontana that follows a very similar pattern of Kaiser's military production during the kind of World War II era and the battles over racial integration that follow as Black workers in the integrated defense industry seek to have, equal life experiences in Fontana as well, right? And so I think a lot of these peripheries actually share some of these things in common. And then fast forwarding to the more recent dynamics that you mentioned, the Antelope Valley was certainly seen as an investment opportunity, I guess you could say, for housing. This isn't a part of the story that I was able to really dig into in as much depth as I would like, but it's certainly understood to be the case that in the wake of the foreclosure crisis and Great Recession, when housing values really plummeted to rock bottom, the Antelope Valley was among the areas with the highest rates of foreclosures in the nation. Many people thought, well, let's buy some of these single family homes and we'll rent them through the Section 8 program for a few years. And when the housing market rebounds, we'll sell them for double or triple what we originally purchased them for. So they were seen as investment opportunities. And in the Antelope Valley today, we still have a scenario of sort of mass corporate purchasing and ownership of many of these rental properties, which I think has driven some of this story as well, right?
Jeremy?
Thanks, Dan. I just wanted to note that Dr. Kurwa was a publisher or editor from UC Press joined and put a note in the comments section also about getting a copy of the book. And so I put that in the comments section as well. Thank you, Maura. And she also shared a discount code. So you can download the ebook for free and or get your paper copy. theirs, and you can get your paper copy with a nice discount. And I'll pass over to Mike now.
Thanks. Can you talk a little bit about who does the policing and the structure of policing in the Antelope Valley, and how that exacerbates or provides an outlet for this kind of abuse?
Yeah, absolutely. So the cities of the Antelope Valley, which are, I mean, the main cities are Lancaster and Palmdale. They're what we call contract cities because they are sort of too small to be able to um, hold a budget for their own independent sort of police departments. And so they contract to the County of Los Angeles and the LA Sheriff's Department for policing services. And that, I think, is a very important part of the story because it shapes a lot of the kind of democratic accountability or lack of when this whole story plays out. So that's one sort of groundwork, I think, foundation piece of this question that's important to know. But really, as Section 8 tenants begin to move to the Antelope Valley in 2006, 7, 8, the cities react in a very negative manner, despite the fact that these tenants are filling homes that might otherwise be vacant or foreclosed. And as they come into these neighborhoods, they're also spending money in the consumer economy, right? Buying groceries, et cetera, that's keeping the Antelope Valley economically afloat in a way that it otherwise might not have. But the Antelope Valley was quite hostile to it. Mike Davis would have called this, raising the gangplanks in a way, right? And although they tried a number of different strategies to kind of cut off the ability of voucher tenants to be able to move up. They tried to make a separate housing authority that was separate from the county housing authority, and it proved to be just too financially expensive to create your own housing authority. They tried like sort of negative advertising to try to dissuade people from moving, specifically voucher tenants from moving to the Antelope Valley. They really threw the kitchen sink at the problem, but the solution that they really landed on and invested in was policing. And they were very clear that through passing a crime-free housing ordinance and a nuisance ordinance, they would begin to make it very easy for neighbors to file nuisance complaints that could result in the eviction of tenants. So a crime-free housing ordinance is like a little bit more of a preventative measure in the sense that it allows or sometimes mandates landlords to deny rental leases to people if they have a prior criminal conviction. The LA Times, Liam Dillon of the LA Times and his co-authors did an investigation of the passage of these crime-free housing ordinances in California and found that the majority of the cities that passed them did so in the wake of Black movement into their neighborhoods. So there's certainly a piece of racial reaction to the spread of these crime-free housing ordinances, which the Department of Justice during the Obama administration noted were potentially violating fair housing law. Nuisance ordinances kind of create a mechanism whereby neighbors can file complaints through like a nuisance hotline, like a 311 style. And they come with different types of leverage because they exist all around the country. But it can be things like, well, once you have 3 nuisance complaints, the property owner may be subject to a fine or may have their rental license revoked or may even eventually get their property confiscated. But you can escape any of those penalties if you evict the person who is the renter, who's the subject of these complaints. So the Antelope Valley cities did both of these things. And they also managed to create a policing partnership with the County of Los Angeles and its housing authority, which turned over the names and addresses of tenants in the program, kind of creating like a target list in a way, and participated in creating their own fraud hotline that people would call and make complaints about, and then they would go and enforce these complaints through inspections of people's homes. And so to get back to your question, the who does the policing, it was neighbors in many cases who were sort of motivated to try to remove Section 8 tenants from their neighborhoods, often based on race or class grievances. It was also the city government, which had also hired its own staff to do some of this eviction work. It were staff from the county housing authority, and then the sort of enforcement mechanism really of the sheriff's deputies who would accompany these staff on these inspections, and also would be able to kind of do searches on people, about other elements of their backgrounds and things like this. So it became a very multi-layered partnership. But I think, to my mind, I want to highlight that the role of neighbors is one that is very important, and I think is really worth our attention, because enfolding sort of average everyday citizens into the work of policing like this really dramatically expanded its reach and created a lot of sort of perverse incentives. And I think we see this kind of participation in policing, or this delegation of policing work to everyday people, playing out in very many problematic ways around the country in different settings.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Dr. Kurwa, I'm aware that there is a prison in Lancaster, and the CDC or CDCR, whatever they're calling it now, that most of those correctional officers tend to live close to where they work. And so I wonder what kind of influence this branch of law enforcement it may have had on policing the area.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a great question. At first blush, one would think that the Antelope Valley would fit very well into the story in Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book, Golden Gulag, which really explores this question of why, during an era of declining rates of crime, did the state of California end up building so many prisons and jails across its geography? And why did those prisons get built where they were built, right? And her answer to that question is that the prison was a sort of spatial fix to a series of other kinds of economic, essentially, incentives or crises, right? And that's why they occurred when and where they ended up being built, right? And the Antelope Valley could really fit a lot of that explanation. And indeed, it did, in a sense that there was the construction of a prison there. It used to be a women's detention center, closed and reopened. And it's had kind of gone through a number of different stages over several decades. But it's never really grown so large as to sort of sustain an economy in the way that many of the other prisons in the state of California outside the major cities have come to sort of play that role, right? Especially along the sort of like Highway 99 corridor. And I think that really part of that story is that the sort of growth of the kind of carceral state in the Antelope Valley happened much more through this delegated form of policing that's happening outside of the sort of prison or jail infrastructure, rather than necessarily through the growth of the more formal systems of incarceration there. I do think you're right that that it is a place where many people who are working in these industries also tend to live, especially because I think, if I recall correctly, I think some of the recent studies done by the Greater Antelope Valley Economic Association have found that something like 40% of working residents in the Antelope Valley are commuters, right, to other places like Los Angeles. So that dynamic, I think, is a pretty common one.
Could you explain the vouchers system, SNAP, Medicaid, CalFresh, and just some of the programs? In other words, the people were being placed there under those kind of conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, the story of the voucher program goes back to the civil rights era, and the growth of public housing, beginning especially in the 1930s, really results in the creation of lots of public housing in major cities like Chicago, New York, St. Louis, et cetera. But the subsequent sort of disinvestment in that public housing, the lack of dollars being spent to repair and maintain facilities or to provide the kind of social services and opportunities that like children and so on would want, lead to a lot of tenant demands, right? There's a very famous sort of tenant rent strike in the Pruitt-Igoe homes in St. Louis in I believe it was like the late 60s or early 70s. And among all these demands, are certainly things about repairs and services and so on, but also sort of what's bubbling up at this time nationally is this idea that the segregated siting of public housing. In other words, the fact that a place like Chicago mostly built its public housing in ways that kind of fit its existing patterns of racial segregation, that this also seemed to deny people in public housing a meaningful right to fair housing, right? And it was interpreted as one of the avenues of fair housing agitation to fight for the kind of more even or equitable spread of public housing across the city, right? So that people would have an integrated experience of public housing. And this becomes the basis for the very famous Gautreaux lawsuit, Dorothy Gautreaux's litigation against the Chicago Housing Authority that accuses it of violating civil rights through its segregated siting. And the remedy, one of the remedies in the Gautreaux case is the voucher, to give people what is essentially a coupon that allows them to rent anywhere they would like in a city, right? And that's essentially how the voucher works, right? You get this voucher, which is sort of like a coupon, and it says to the landlord that the federal government, the housing authority, will pay what's called a fair market rent that's calculated based on rents in the area to the landlord directly. And that's regular and predictable, which is very advantageous to landlords. And the tenant themselves will pay a portion of their income, usually 30%, to the housing authority as a form of rent. So they're really renting in a way from the housing authority in this kind of circuitous manner. And you should be able to, in theory, take this voucher and rent anywhere you would like, right? But in reality, what's happened is that landlords tend to discriminate against voucher tenants or to find other ways to deny voucher tenants access to many of these units, and that the voucher program has not ended up generating as much kind of geographic mobility as was originally hoped for or expected. And that also means that the kind of other expected benefits, economic and otherwise, from this voucher program have not really come through. And on the other side of that, I think we see the social experiences of many of these voucher tenants being very costly, right? Not just the kinds of harassment and discrimination and policing that a tenant like Michelle Ross would have experienced, but also people who are being forced to move very far from their original homes and communities, having to travel back, to their original communities for things like church and family, visits and things like this, and trying to integrate into a new economy that they might otherwise not be very familiar with. This sort of voucherization, of federal subsidized housing really occurred on a mass scale and was part of what sort of counteracted the demolition of public housing beginning in the late 1980s and going into the 2000s. And so today we have something like, I think 2.3 million households that use the voucher program, which roughly would equate to something like 5 million people in total who would benefit from the program. That is only a fraction, 1/4 of the number of people who are eligible for the program and who could and perhaps should be able to access it. But it is a part of this broader privatization of the social safety net, which has come with a number of different complications, across the board.
Thank you. Could you talk about Michelle Ross a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So her tenancy sort of, is the catalyst for what happens, right? And over time, the experiences of herself and of a number of other tenants begin to bubble up into the sort of public consciousness of the Black community in the Antelope Valley. And it comes through churches, and local pastors hear about it. It comes to an organization called the Community Action League. And they begin to sort of piece together that it's not just a one-time thing or one person experiencing it, that this is beginning to be something like a mass experience that tenants are having. And the tenants themselves, the voucher program is very atomizing. So you don't necessarily know the other people who are voucher tenants in your area. So it's very hard to organize. And so it became organizations like churches and like the Community Action League that become the vehicles to kind of catalog and coalesce these stories and to get these people together who are sharing these experiences to be able to begin to do something about it. And so what happens is that the Community Action League um, led by a number of people who are cataloged in the book, like Pharaoh Mitchell and Jesse Smith, really begin to organize things like town halls, where hundreds of tenants show up to say, "This is what I've been experiencing from my neighbors, or the sheriff's department, or the city, or housing authority." And this is like sort of the thing that makes it possible for fair housing lawyers to begin to litigate. And it's a really interesting partnership between communities in the Antelope Valley, which have very few legal services, and the kind of much stronger legal services community in Los Angeles proper. And they kind of make this alliance, right, where they begin to collect testimonials and prepare litigation. And the litigation, Michelle Ross becomes the lead plaintiff in the case. There's a few other plaintiffs who are listed as well, but she becomes sort of like the face of the litigation and gives some public testimonial as to what happens to her. And the goal of the litigation is really to kind of break up this policing partnership, to make it so that the county feels that its role in this might be unconstitutional, that the housing authority realizes that it may not be legal for it to hand over the names and addresses of its tenants to a city government, right? And so that once you kind of pull apart these pieces, this policing system can't necessarily function as effectively or as efficiently as it did in the past. And we end up seeing two levels of organizing, or maybe three levels of organizing, I would say. TCAL did these town halls and organized protests. So you have that kind of community mobilization. There's a first layer of litigation that's really targeted at the cities of the Antelope Valley and the county of Los Angeles that tries to pull apart these pieces of this policing partnership. And then you have the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division that hears what's going on and sends its staff to come and collect testimonials as well. And the DOJ launches its own fair housing case. And I think this is the first in the nation case that assesses that policing practices can violate fair housing law. And it sues the county of Los Angeles and the county sheriff's department for its role in violating people's sort of fair housing guarantees, essentially. And there are different versions of success at each of these levels, right? I think the most successful was that kind of middle level of litigation at the city and county level. And the Department of Justice's work, although it reached a settlement in 2015, many of the items that were mandated by the settlement have taken years to actually be implemented or haven't been implemented yet. And this kind of stalled reform of the sheriff's department and its practices have had many costs for residents of the Antelope Valley, even until very recent months and years.
Excellent. Thank you, Rahim. We don't have any questions in the Q&A at the moment. Does anyone else from the panel have any thoughts that they'd like to share? Sure,
Quick
Jeremy.
jump in that we are nearing our stop time. So if anyone had any wrap-up questions, or if Dr. Kurwa had any parting shots for us.
Thank you so much for that conversation. It's neat to see that Amber lived in the area, and so she probably had firsthand knowledge of it and saw some of the things going on. You know, the homelessness, the low-income housing, and so on. It happens everywhere, and that's the sad part. Organized housing where they stack everybody in the same area, and I don't know how you change that. You know, the DOJ gets involved, and like you said, the corrections are so slow and sometimes never come about, so there's not a real solution. But we thank you for coming and joining us today and sharing that. And I suggest everybody get a book, and let me see if I can get it to work. No, it's not working. Anyway, get the book, and like Jeremy said, it's on discount, so so get the hard copy. So that's a good thing. And thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And if I may, maybe there is one sort of last wrap up thing to say if there is time.
Yes,
I
do.
think that one of the kind of national lessons from this book is about the need to see housing justice and police reform as very linked. That the home is a site of policing, not just in the Antelope Valley, but in cities around the country where crime-free and nuisance ordinances are playing out, where people are having horrible policing experiences through platforms like Nextdoor and Ring. The home is very much a site where policing is happening, and I think it's incumbent upon us, for those of us who are kind of doing for housing or housing justice work, or for those of us who do police reform type work, to see that intersection and to figure out the ways where kind of tackling the policing of housing can lend itself to both housing justice and a sort of less policed kind of environment. And so there's definitely a laundry list of types of things to tackle and things that people are doing around the country. But I think as a general direction, I think that's an important one for people who are concerned about justice to go in.
Thank you, and it's good to have you doing just that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rahim.
Thank you so much for having me.
Conversations on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Faux Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Finn Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yavor provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming and to find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, Dorothy Roberts, and many more.